What's up, 8 Push peeps? We are going to cover Ronald Reagan, the president that you need to know in terms of the 1980s. A couple basics that you need to know about him. The first is that his policies are going to connect to the 1920s and the Gilded Age. So there's your thematic connection across time and space. So the actor from the 50s becomes the president. So we'll get started here. The election of 1980. The big question he asks himself is, ask yourself, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And that is a thing that people have said every election since that. They've worded it in different ways, but it's the same premise. Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And the president that was before was Jimmy Carter. And a nice guy, right? The Camp David Accords, but you also have some serious problems in terms of the OPEC oil crisis, the Iran hostage situation. And so life is not very good in the United States. So people need a strong leader. Jimmy Carter is a nice guy, but not the best of leaders. Okay? There's a group that's going to get him elected, and that's called the New Right. Okay, and the New Right was started in 1964 under Barry Goldwater, where Ronald Reagan gave a speech supporting this guy, and they want three things, and I call it CLAM. The C is containment of communism. The L is laissez-faire, the government stays out of your business, and then the M is the moral majority. People have said, look at this, what happened in the 60s. There's children behaving badly, becoming hippies, smoking. You had promiscuousness with sex. You also had the birth control and Roe v. Wade in the 60s and 70s. So it's just all those things like, let's put an end to this liberalism that America has created for himself. All right? So Ronald Reagan promises a new morning in America, Reagan Revolution. The group that gets him elected, the New Right. Cool? Moving on. The Iran hostage situation, day one, the hostages are released. All right? The Ayatollah is not going to screw around with Ronald Reagan. He wanted to make Jimmy Carter look bad. And so bottom line, the hostages are free. Moving on. Sandra Day O'Connor is the first female Supreme Court Chief Justice, or Justice in general. And so she has her mark on history and is important in some landmark decisions that we'll talk about later. In terms of Reaganomics, now what you need to know is that all the Republicans before this tended to basically raise tariffs. Republicans raise tariffs. But once you get to Reagan, it switches. All right? And so he's going to lower taxes and tariffs. And so it's called trickle-down theory. And supposedly, the money from the rich, from the tax cuts, goes all the way down to the common people at the bottom. You be the judge if it actually works or not. And increased military spending and deregulation, meaning kind of like laissez-faire, that the government's not going to get involved in business. As long as the economy's booming, nobody cares. All right? So the economy's going to go up. All right? Which is nice. It's really nice. The environment's going to be hurt. There's huge tax cuts for the rich. And so the government is going to be on the side of business, all right? So it's like the Gilded Age all over again. Air traffic controllers go on strike, and Ronald Reagan says, you have a choice. You can either go back to work or you can be fired. And they're like, we're standing up and getting our benefits and what we believe in. He's like, well, that's great. You're fired, all right? You're fired, all right? And risky investments by the savings and loan company, all right? And we also up here have huge deficit spending. Our national budget goes from like $900 billion of deficit spending money we don't have, to $2 trillion. So, you know, that's your spending policies there. And one of the biggest things, the biggest ideas here, brings us to the Strategic Defense Initiative, sometimes nicknamed Star Wars. The goal is to make the USS nuclear weapons obsolete. The idea is you're going to have satellites with lasers and they're going to blow up any nuclear weapons. Communism in Russia is doing what it does best. Goes up, stagnates, and now it's on the decline. It can never sustain itself for very long. And so Russia can't really compete with this. They can barely feed their own people. They're getting a lot of grain from us. All right? Let's look at the Cold War abroad. There's going to be terrorism in Libya. We're going to remove our troops in Lebanon. And then basically Leonid Brezhnev dies, and we've got two people take his place, Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Churenko. They aren't really that important to know. They're important for Russia, but not so much for the 8-Push exam. The next guy that follows is important. All right, so let's look at the Reagan Doctrine. The Reagan Doctrine, the U.S. will support any anti-communist government. Doesn't matter if they're nice, doesn't matter if they're mean. As long as they're anti-communist, that's good enough for us. So we've got a crisis in Grenada, El Salvador, and the Philippines, where we support some not so nice people. But here's what you need to know. In Afghanistan, remember that the Russians invaded that in 1979, and so the United States is going to give Stinger missiles to Mujahideen to beat the Russians. And guess what? Some of those people are going to be terrorists later on, like Osama bin Laden is one of those groups. So it's kind of one of those things that we helped them out to beat the Russians, and it comes back and bites us in the butt. All right, in other news, we've got the Iran-Contra affair. The Sandinista are a communist group that takes over Nicaragua, and the United States is going to train a group of people called the Contras. And the Contras are going to fight the Sandinista, but they're also going to be responsible for some pretty shady human rights violations. So there's a thing in Congress called the Boland Amendment that says the United States cannot help the Contras anymore. They're creating human rights abuses. So what's the United States going to do? Well, it's going to give weapons to Iran to help overthrow the Ayatollah, who's saying death to America. And that money and weapons are going to, from Iran, is going to go to the Contras. And guess what? The public finds out about this. It's a big thing. On the news every night. And so Oliver North, who's a lieutenant colonel for the Marine Corps, he's going to be fired and reprimanded, and 10 other people are going to be convicted. But here's what you need to know. Ronald Reagan, if this would have happened to anybody else, they would have been in big trouble. But Ronald Reagan says, I didn't know about this. I'll take full responsibility for it, but it happened under my watch, but I didn't know it was I didn't know it was going on. And so he becomes the Teflon president, where like Teflon, nothing sticks to it. And so people are like, oh yeah, it's Ronald Reagan. He survived cancer and people shooting him and the hostages, so it's Ronald Reagan. Yeah, it doesn't affect him. All right. Moving on, the Challenger explosion. It's a space shuttle, and there's going to be a teacher that goes into space with 6 other astronauts. And unfortunately, there's a malfunction, and on live television, every student in America was watching it at this time. It explodes, and it's a national tragedy. And Ronald Reagan does a good job of bringing the nation together. Every generation has their Challenger moment. For my grandparents, it was, Pearl Harbor. For my parents, it was where were you when JFK was shot. For me, it was a couple of things, but the one that I remember best is obviously 9/11. So each generation kind of has their moment. All right, moving on to the fall of communism, the moment you've all been waiting for. Well, guess what? Trinko dies, all right? And we're going to have a guy, Mikhail Gorbachev is going to take his name, and he's got 2 policies, and there's too much tension in Afghanistan, all right? So he wants to calm all these things down. So he's got 2 policies, perestroika, which sounds terrible, but it's actually really nice. Basically what it means is Russia's going to switch to capitalism, a free market economy, and they're also going to get rid of the arms race. I mean, they can't compete with Star Wars. No one can compete with Star Wars. Even though we don't actually do it, it scares the crap out of the Russians. And so he's like, we can't compete, so we're going to end the arms race. And we're also going to have increased civil liberties and increase transparency with the government, called glasnost, like glass, see-through transparency with the government. So 2 very awesome things are happening. And then in 1985, guess what? Russia's losing in Afghanistan, and they leave. All right? So in 1989, a couple awesome things happened for the world. Number 1, Eastern Bloc countries fall from communism. So countries that are right next to Russia, they fall from communism. Then the Berlin Wall is going to be torn down after Ronald Reagan says, Mr. Gorbachev, if you mean what you say about perestroika and glasnost, about bettering relations with the United States, then Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And guess what? He allows it to be ripped down. And then democracy spreads to China. It still has a long way to go personally today, but it is a step. And so you have student protesters demanding free speech, and you have the event at Tiananmen Square, the massacre in Beijing, and then the person standing in front of the tank. Very famous picture. We talked about it in class. In other news and culture, MTV, who doesn't love that? You've got rock, you've got hair bands of the 80s, you've got Bon Jovi. You also have hip hop, which is in reaction to the crack epidemic. AIDS is spreading, and they do a thing on Washington, D.C. because thousands of people are dying, then it turns into millions of people are dying, but the government's not doing anything about it. And so they have a big quilt there, and every person that died of AIDS is there, and it really makes the government think about this, because it adds a name to each person that has died, as opposed to just statistics. Crack cocaine is going to create some urban problems. Crime in the United States, 50s, 60s is kind of doing this, 70s it starts going up, but when you get to the 80s, it's like, boom, all the way up there. All right, arcades, computer games, Steve Jobs creates the Macintosh and computers for average people. Wow, kind of sounds like Henry Ford and cars. Make things available to the populace, and you'll make lots of money in the process. So ladies and gentlemen, that is Ronald Reagan in a couple of minutes. Very important president. The Cold War is almost over, and essentially the big stuff is over with it. We just got some residual stuff left. So, study, get ready. The A-Push exam is right around the corner. May the force be with you and all of you.